She was the Empire's rare golden-haired princess, born once in 100 years, yet also the trash her own mother always saw as worthless next to her brother. All because of the Empire's law forbidding women from taking the throne, the current sovereign became the pit that trapped the Empress. And the little princess, with her golden hair and blue eyes, looking so much like the Empress, was despised by her own birth mother. Even the ill-fated daughter of the royal house looked down on her. Until, on her 18th birthday, the little princess discovered the truth. Her mother had murdered that girl. The consort had originally intended to make her the scapegoat for the girl's death. But the little princess refused to cooperate, and in the end died tragically at her own mother's hands. However, all of this was merely a nightmare the little princess had dreamed. Right now, she was still just an 8-year-old girl. At first, she chalked up everything that would happen in the future to being just a dream. But as time passed, many of those nightmares began coming true. All because her twin brother's maid had secretly eaten his birthday cake and framed the little princess for it. The consort locked her in her room to reflect for 3 days and nights without a single meal. But now, having the ability to foresee the future, the little princess finally had a way to protect herself. Golden hair and blue eyes were the unique mark of the royal line's heir. So right now, the Empress was her only chance at survival. So she cried out for help from inside her room, hoping some passing maid would come to her aid. Unexpectedly, the door that had supposedly been locked wasn't locked at all. To avoid detection, this was simply another one of her mother's methods of torment. The little princess carefully slipped past a passing maid and left the princess's palace. Since she'd been confined to the princess's palace and never stepped outside since childhood, she had no idea where the Empress's private chambers were located. So she relied purely on her instincts and took her first step forward. Walking through an unfamiliar garden, the extremely wary little princess noticed someone was following her. The one approaching was none other than her twin brother, but in the very next instant, a pair of unfamiliar hands suddenly covered her mouth. The twins had been born on the very same day, yet their mother only ever loved the red-haired one. Shielded by this mysterious figure, the little princess managed to successfully hide her trail, avoiding discovery by both the consort and her prince brother. Her mother doted endlessly on her brother, while she herself couldn't even earn a single smile, was met with nothing but disappointment. Tears began falling from the little princess's eyes like pearls, startling the boy standing behind her half to death. He hurried to explain he hadn't meant to make her cry, bending down to slowly calm her emotions. It wasn't until their eyes met that the little princess suddenly recalled she had once seen this boy's figure in her prophetic dream. Though she couldn't quite remember exactly who he was, she hurriedly backed away to a safe distance and asked who he was. He had originally come as commanded to attend the second prince's birthday banquet, but he genuinely despised the second prince's arrogant, domineering attitude, so he'd slipped out of the banquet altogether. Seeing the girl hiding her tracks with a cloak, he guessed she too must not want to attend the prince's birthday feast, so he proposed they keep each other's secret. Neither would tell a third person about the other. Sneaking out of the banquet, he then told the little princess that the Empress had originally arranged this grand banquet to celebrate the birthday of both siblings together, but the princess, who was equally the guest of honor, had never once made an appearance, so he'd come to the back garden to try his luck, hoping he'd find a chance to deliver the gift he'd prepared to the little princess. Only then did the girl realize that today was also her birthday. Despite being twins, the spotlight belonged to her brother alone. Overwhelmed with unfair sorrow, she instinctively blurted out that today was her birthday too. The girl grew afraid this would expose her true identity, but instead, the boy handed her the gift he had, a truly beautiful bracelet. He fastened the bracelet onto the little princess's wrist and told her not to feel burdened by it. The princess would surely receive plenty more gifts at the banquet. This one was simply a friend's birthday gift to her. The little princess was deeply grateful for the boy's thoughtfulness, because this was the very first gift she had ever received in her entire life. As they parted, the boy also wished the little princess a happy birthday. The little princess smiled faintly, silently committing the boy's face to memory. If she managed to find the Empress safely, she'd be sure to tell the boy her own name. After enduring countless hardships, the little princess finally crawled out from the bushes, only to find that the one who discovered her was the crown prince himself. The frailest little princess in the whole empire had finally crossed mountains and valleys to reach another palace, all just to see the Empress who could change her fate. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince had refused the request to attend the twins' joint birthday banquet, all because the conniving consort had not only stolen away his most beloved father, but had also repeatedly framed those closest to him. So whenever anything at all involved the consort, the Crown Prince showed nothing but disgust. He never once believed the little princess could possess the same golden hair and blue eyes as him, since she was merely a child of the puppet emperor and that vicious consort, nowhere near the true royal bloodline. So the rumors, he assumed, had to be wrong. The Empress was, by right, the empire's true final heir to the throne, but due to the law forbidding women from ruling, she chose to marry the puppet emperor instead, bearing the Crown Prince as the candidate for the next emperor. The Crown Prince deeply resented this law of the empire, openly declaring that once he took the throne, his very first decree would be to amend the constitution. But just then, a small round bundle crawled right out from the bushes. Hearing the noise, his attendants readied themselves to protect the Crown Prince at any moment. The next instant, the prince himself blocked them from behind, discovering it was only a small, round little girl. Staring at her for a full 3 minutes, the Crown Prince finally realized that the rumor of the golden hair and blue eyes had actually been true. Since she was the vicious consort's daughter, he demanded to know what scheme the little princess was up to. The little princess suddenly realized her concealing cloak had already slipped off and vanished. So she summoned every ounce of courage and told her prince brother of her determination to see the Empress. Had it not been for that unmistakable golden hair and blue eyes, no one would ever have believed the girl before him was the empire's one and only little princess. Yet the man still refused to grant her request to meet the Empress. He flatly declined, sending men to escort her straight back to the consort instead. The very next moment, the little princess, having not had a single drop of water in 3 days, collapsed unconscious, even with her very last breath, still refusing to return to her mother's palace. Now the Crown Prince found himself in a bind. He'd only meant to send her back where she belonged, never expecting the girl would actually pass out. It was only then the man noticed her clothing was worse than that of the lowest-ranking palace maid, and her body was far frailer than any child her age. So he immediately ordered an attendant to fetch a physician right away. That the empire's most exalted crown prince apparently had a 5-year-old daughter, and not only that, but had raised her secretly in his own palace, with the Empress's permission, left absolutely everyone stunned. The maid could hardly believe this little princess was actually the consort's daughter. By looks alone, she didn't resemble the consort's child at all, yet the Crown Prince still wasn't at ease. Keeping the vicious consort's daughter so close to himself, his plan was simply to wait until the little princess had recovered, and then send her straight back to the wicked consort. But the physician he'd summoned brought him a shocking piece of news. The little princess didn't just have severe injuries on her body, but also chronic malnutrition over the years, which was exactly what had caused her collapse in the back garden. The physician was curious whose child she was, then unexpectedly glanced toward the Crown Prince, who bore quite a resemblance to the girl. It instantly all clicked. He quietly asked the Crown Prince whether the Empress even knew this girl existed. Ever since the loss of her own infant daughter, the Empress had fallen ill from grief, shutting herself away in her chambers day after day, buried in official documents, trying to numb herself. If he were to bring the little princess to see her now, it might only stir up his mother's painful memories. This was exactly why the Crown Prince had, at first, refused to let the princess meet with his mother. The guard knight asked whether her condition might affect the princess's healthy growth going forward. The physician had assumed the princess was merely a 5-year-old girl, in which case it naturally wouldn't affect her much. But the knight then informed her the little princess was actually 8 years old, which left the physician utterly thunderstruck. After all, the Crown Prince had only just come of age not long ago. And now, suddenly, an 8-year-old daughter appears? The knight quickly cut off that train of thought, saying she was the little princess, the consort's own daughter. The Crown Prince behind her gave the physician a deeply displeased look. So someone had genuinely assumed he'd fathered a child out of wedlock. Just where did she get the nerve for that? The man, however, explained with an innocent expression, saying it was only because the Crown Prince bore such a striking resemblance to the little princess. Who could have guessed that the consort, who so doted on her son, would freely siphon off the little princess's budget and hand it over for the prince to use instead? They'd always heard the consort favored her son over her daughter, but never imagined the favoritism went this far. The captain of the knights asked the Crown Prince, with more than a hint of sarcasm, whether he'd be sending the princess back to the consort After learning of the little princess's true circumstances, there was naturally no way she could be sent back now. But then the question became, who exactly would take on the duty of caring for her? Since his own personal attendants had all been harmed by the wicked consort before, they weren't exactly the ideal candidates. Yet he decided this wasn't the little princess's fault at all, and took on this responsibility himself. When the little princess awoke once again, she found herself lying on a plush, enormous bed. Looking around at the magnificent surroundings, a sudden shout startled her. So badly she nearly tripped and fell. Thankfully, a pair of hands from behind caught her just in time. No one had expected that once she'd recovered, the little princess would grab hold of the crown prince's hem, begging her brother to spare her life. Never having been loved, the little princess woke up to find herself lying in a magnificent golden palace. Secretly relieved she hadn't been caught by her mother, she recalled that right before she'd fainted, she had briefly met the crown prince. To prevent any further complications, the little princess had to leave this place as soon as possible and safely meet with the Empress. But suddenly, a maid appeared behind her, and the distracted little princess nearly tumbled to the ground. Thankfully, a pair of large hands caught her just in time. The maid warmly introduced herself, saying she was the crown prince's personal maid, and from now on would be in charge of the little princess's daily needs. The princess mistakenly believed that, having just escaped her wicked mother's control, she was now being held captive by the crown prince instead. But her mutterings were overheard by the crown prince standing right behind her. A stern voice told her to speak properly. Discovering the crown prince standing right there, the little princess was so terrified she collapsed to the floor, clutching tightly onto the hem of his robe, begging her brother to spare her life. Never expecting to have frightened her this badly, the crown prince bent down and offered his sister an apology. However, the princess never imagined the crown prince would ever apologize to her, because the maids at the princess's palace had always said the crown prince was a terrifying, wicked man who despised everything connected to the consort, herself included. Just as she thought this, her stomach let out an embarrassing growl. The little princess flushed red with shame, but in the very next instant, the crown prince simply scooped her up and carried her straight to the dining hall, asking her what food she wanted most. Before this, living in that cold, neglected palace, no one had ever once asked how she felt, her meals nothing but leftover scraps grown cold. All she could do was search her memory for the wonderful food she'd eaten in her dream, stammering out a single word. Thankfully, the crown prince quickly understood. She meant she wanted something sweet. This little princess had tasted the most delicious food in her prophetic dream, yet couldn't quite recall who had given her that dessert. Only the terrifying memories her mother had left her with remained. Since the little princess's body still hadn't fully recovered, she was only allowed soup for today. The little princess understood full well that she was living under someone else's roof now. Being able to stay in such a fine place with food to eat was already more than enough. Yet, arriving at the dining hall, this little round bundle looked just like Thumbelina, since she was so much smaller than children her age. So, the crown prince personally held her while she ate, leaving her overwhelmed with such unexpected favor. Seeing the girl's astonished expression, the crown prince assumed the food simply wasn't to her taste. What surprised him instead was just how delicious this simple vegetable soup could be. She'd never eaten anything so wonderful in her life. She asked the crown prince if she could have another bowl. Surprised at how quickly she'd finished her portion, the little princess suddenly realized she'd said the wrong thing, immediately backtracking that it was fine if it wasn't convenient. After all, this was the very first time she'd tasted something this wonderful. The crown prince could hardly bear to imagine what kind of life the little princess must have led before this. That a princess of the royal house had never once even had vegetable soup, so he made her a promise. Tomorrow he'd bring her hot cocoa to make up for the dessert she hadn't had today. And this was the very first time the little princess had ever truly felt anyone's care for her. Though equally a child of the royal family, the little princess had only ever known life in that cold, neglected palace. Thinking about this, the crown prince felt a deep ache in his heart. He immediately had a magnificent bedroom prepared for the little princess, and warned her never again to bring up that dump she'd previously lived in. As long as she liked it, this would be her room from now on. The little princess wasn't certain whether this happiness was something she truly deserved, yet selfishly, she wanted to hold on to this brief warmth for a little longer. Although the little princess now lived a fairy tale-like existence, nightmares still haunted her constantly, because ever since her birth, she had known nothing but her mother's scolding and abuse, never once experiencing what it truly meant to have the privileges of a princess. Startled awake from the huge bed, she found hot cocoa waiting for her to enjoy. This was because the crown prince had already instructed the maids to prepare it beforehand, simply to fulfill his promise to his little sister. Though the hot cocoa was absolutely delicious, the little princess felt she didn't deserve any of this. Fully knowing her mother had done so many terrible things to the crown prince, and yet here she was, greedily enjoying everything her prince brother offered her. If she was bound to leave eventually anyway, how would she ever repay the kindness she'd received here in the crown prince's palace? But her train of thought was interrupted by the maid beside her, who was busy grumbling about how dense the crown prince was. Just as the little princess kindly meant to warn her, the crown prince's questioning voice suddenly rang out from behind them. Startled, the maid scolded the prince for sneaking up on them from behind like that. The tardy knight, arriving late, only added fuel to the fire, agreeing wholeheartedly with the maid's complaint. Even though today was technically the second day after the little princess's birthday, he'd still prepared a birthday present for her. The little princess adored the birthday gift the knight gave her, because it was only the second gift she'd ever received in her life. As she hugged the rabbit plushie tightly, the bracelet the boy had given her earlier accidentally slipped into view. The crown prince could tell from the fine craftsmanship that it surely wasn't something the consort had given her. He quietly ordered his aide to secretly investigate the bracelet's origins, thinking about everything her mother had done to her, and the stark contrast against the fleeting happiness she now had. The little princess suddenly broke down sobbing. This startled all three onlookers terribly. Thankfully, the crown prince turned out to be quite skilled at soothing his sister. He pulled out chocolate he'd already prepared, successfully coaxing the little princess to sleep. But feeding chocolate to a small child just to get her to sleep was never going to be a sustainable solution. Since none of them really knew how to care for a child, the maid suggested informing the Empress of the situation. But this was met with fierce opposition from both men, having assumed that as the daughter of the wicked consort, she'd surely face nothing but insults and rejection here. She never expected the crown prince to be such a huge sister lover, absolutely doting on her. Every year, on the anniversary of the first princess's death, the Empress's emotions grew very unstable, so much so that during this period, she would even treat her distant relative's child, Lulu, as if she were her own daughter. If the Empress ever found out that the little princess had endured years of abuse, it would surely devastate her. Not only that, if word of the little princess's true circumstances spread throughout the entire empire, her reputation would quickly be dragged down by the consort, who would then abuse her even more severely. So the crown prince decided to keep it a secret for now, planning to wait until his mother's emotions had stabilized before informing her of the princess's situation. The little princess found the vegetable soup wasn't quite as delicious as it had been the first time, ever since the knight had been caught sneaking chocolate to her, and it was confiscated by the maid. The little princess never got another chance to taste dessert, and could only obediently drink her soup in her room. Though the kind-hearted maid had told her she could ring the bell to call for help, the little princess had faced so much criticism the last time she went to the dining hall. Once people learned she was the consort's daughter, their eyes filled with contempt and displeasure, so she never dared ring that bell. All she could do was wait quietly in her room. Yet in the very next moment, the knight secretly came again to bring the little princess chocolate, only to be caught red-handed by the furious maid. Unexpectedly, the maid then prepared a lavish afternoon tea for the little princess, since with the physician's approval, the little princess was now allowed simple meals. However, right as the little princess was enjoying herself thoroughly, the crown prince suddenly appeared behind her out of nowhere. Startled, the little princess nearly choked, and the maid shot the crown prince a superior, judgmental glare directly. He'd actually brought a little handmade doll his sister had made as a gift for the Empress. The little princess said she loved it very much. The crown prince teased her, saying a cheap little trinket like that could win her over so easily. The little princess felt his words were rather harsh, and instinctively shot back at the crown prince. Just as she was about to apologize but held back, the crown prince said it was just his own joke gone a bit too far. The little princess realized that even though she was the consort's daughter, her prince brother didn't actually dislike her, but she still wanted to test this theory of hers once more. So she pointed at a cake sitting far away from her, asking the crown prince to pass it to her. Even though the crown prince grumbled about it out loud, his honest body still moved to help anyway. But the ever-mischievous maid, never one to miss a chance for teasing, actually told the little princess to close her eyes. The very next moment, the crown prince actually fed her a bite of cake with his own hand, a daughter of a lowly earl. Foolishly dreaming of becoming the Empress's own daughter, not only did the crown prince refuse to acknowledge her, even the Empress banned her from her presence, all because she'd publicly exposed the Empress's deepest wound, telling her the harsh truth that her own daughter had already passed away. Now that his mother had safely passed through the danger zone of her grief-stricken mood, the crown prince decided to head to her chambers and inform her about the little princess who now lived with him. But along the way, he happened to run into the Countess. The woman assumed that as long as her daughter could win the Empress's favor, she could rise from a sparrow to a phoenix. The Crown Prince, however, warned her not to entertain such foolish delusions. A sparrow could never become a phoenix. The woman was furious after hearing this, but she refused to give up. As long as her daughter successfully rose in status, making the Empress her legal guardian, even the Crown Prince himself wouldn't be able to keep acting so arrogant. The Crown Prince arrived to see his mother dismissing the Earl's daughter, Lucia. The little girl then grabbed his hem, acting spoiled. "I'm your sister. There's nothing here I shouldn't be allowed to hear." The Crown Prince said, "I only have one sister." Yet in the very next moment, the girl claimed the real one was already dead. Furious, the Crown Prince pulled his arm away and scolded her for entertaining such delusions all on her own. Hearing this, the Empress too grew displeased, issuing an order banning her, warning that if the girl ever spoke so disrespectfully again, she would never be allowed near again. The Empress was originally a woman of decisive action, even after the former emperor passed away. And with the current emperor lost in the pleasures of the harem, she alone had managed to turn the tide. Running the entire empire in perfect order, the Crown Prince finally realized he'd worried too much. His mother was hardly the fragile, delicate woman he'd imagined. So he told the Empress everything: the little princess's severe injuries and collapse. The Empress was deeply shocked upon hearing this. Though the little princess had been living in the Crown Prince's palace these past few days, not a single word about her disappearance had ever come from the princess's own palace, which showed clearly enough that in her former home, no one had ever cared whether the little princess lived or died. The Empress never imagined the little princess had endured such a fate. She regretted deeply not having claimed her as her own daughter from the very start. She immediately set out at once, heading to the Crown Prince's palace to check on the princess. Though not her biological daughter, in the very first days after the little princess was born, the Empress had often gone to visit her, feeling an instant, deep connection with her, almost as if seeing her own daughter again. Yet the consort, learning how eager the Empress was for a daughter, had actually hidden the little princess away, keeping the two apart. The Empress had considered searching for the little princess before, but out of fear of the vicious rumors among the royal daughters, she had deliberately kept her distance from the girl instead. She never imagined that her own negligence had led the little princess into such a wretched life. Yet upon reaching the entrance to the chambers, the Empress suddenly hesitated, even though the maid had told her. The little princess had been in very good spirits lately, and the Crown Prince had even described her appetite as being like a bottomless pit. The Empress still had her worries. She feared the little princess might resent her. Seeing his mother's hesitant expression, the Crown Prince simply pushed the door open himself, urging his mother to hurry inside. But the little princess had already fallen asleep. The Empress never expected an 8-year-old child would be so frail and small, her heart flooding with tender pity for the girl. But suddenly, the little princess rolled over in her sleep, leaving the Empress's hand frozen midair. She then gently patted her, soothing her back to sleep. Afterward, the Empress went to the Crown Prince's office, summoning the steward in charge of financial expenditures. She pulled out the report on the little princess's situation, asking the steward whether he'd known about this. The man was utterly shocked. As far as he knew, there had been many odd expenses at the princess's palace over the years, but he never imagined someone had been embezzling from her funds so blatantly. The steward immediately apologized to the Empress, admitting he bore responsibility for the oversight. The Empress stripped the consort of her authority over the finances. From now on, all of the princess's expenses would be personally reviewed by her. The consort, whose spending had now been slashed, naturally wouldn't take this lying down. She'd surely come looking for trouble with the Empress. But this time, the Empress refused to let it slide either, declaring that if there was ever a problem, the consort could come deal with it herself, face to face. The Crown Prince was very pleased with his mother's decisive handling of the matter, until suddenly, a suspicious noise came from just outside the door. Even as the Empire's most exalted Crown Prince, he still couldn't hide his joy over the very first bite of dessert his little sister had given him. Meanwhile, his mother, tempting the little princess with sweets, was preparing to take her away to her own palace, sulking silently the whole time. The Crown Prince opened his door, only to find the little princess happily roughhousing with the knight. He asked why she'd gone out, alone, without any of her usual escorts. The kind-hearted little princess never liked bothering others too much, so she decided to simply go find food herself. The Crown Prince suddenly felt that to the little princess. He must seem like nothing more than a walking snack stall. So he asked his mother if she'd like to join them for a meal. It was only then the little princess noticed the Empress's presence. Though the Empress was known for her compassion, she surely couldn't possibly like the daughter of the wicked woman who'd stolen away her budget. And with her own son now clearly doting on this little princess, in a situation like this, she was only bound to grow more resentful of her. Thinking about this, the little princess said not a single word once she reached the dining hall. Appearing utterly downcast, the crown prince asked why the little princess had suddenly turned so shy. Hadn't she just been so desperate to meet the Empress earlier? The Empress worried that maybe her own presence had affected the princess's appetite. But the crown prince gave a firm no in response. During her entire stay at his palace these past few days, she'd never once been able to resist good food. Yet in the very next moment, the crown prince handed the little princess a piece of steak he'd already cut for her. The girl's face instantly lit up with the most overjoyed expression. The Empress could hardly believe this was something her cold, distant son was actually doing. All this time, he'd always kept every one of his other relatives and siblings at a firm, cold distance. Seeing the crown prince personally wipe the little princess's oily lips clean, the Empress felt genuine joy at her son's transformation. But seeing the plump little princess always brought back a wave of sorrow, reminding her of her own late daughter. The little princess was so utterly endearing that even the sneaky look on her face when swiping pudding was genuinely heartwarming to witness. Her only real flaw was how easily she could be lured away by bad people offering food. The Empress, however, worried the little princess might not be eating well under her son's care. The crown prince immediately protested, teasing back that this little girl ate more than a cow and still hadn't even learned the story of humbly yielding to others. Yet, in the very next instant, the little princess held out the very last bite of pudding, right in front of the crown prince, inviting him to enjoy that final, precious bite. The Empress warned the crown prince to mind his words carefully in front of a child, never wanting to witness her son bullying the little princess. The crown prince felt a shiver run down his spine. The next moment, the Empress mentioned she'd like to bring the little princess to her own chambers to raise her, saying she had plenty of desserts waiting there too. Watching his mother tempt her with sweets like that, the crown prince grew visibly displeased. The Empress told the little princess to make her own choice. Even though staying at her prince brother's palace wasn't necessarily the best option, since her mother could come take her back at any moment, and the Empress was truly her only guarantee of safety, she still couldn't bear to leave the people and life she'd found here. So she decided to stay. The Empress understood and respected her choice. But in the very next moment, a maid arrived bearing unwelcome news. Though she was the Empire's one and only little princess, she was also its most lowly existence. To keep the little princess's heart from suffering yet another wound, the crown prince decided to take her away right then. But the little princess had already seen right through the whole thing. If it concerned her own mother, surely she had the right to know as well. Yet the crown prince still didn't want her to read the report, so he made up some excuse to forcibly pull her away from the dining hall. It turned out the maids at the princess's palace had quietly been searching for any trace of the little princess. It seemed the consort still hadn't realized her daughter was missing, so they wouldn't be tracking her down here anytime soon. Afterward, the Empress asked the maid what kind of desserts the little princess liked, and for several days in a row, sent a different variety of sweets to the little princess. Even the candy boxes themselves were made from fine crystal. The little princess felt undeserving of it all. She wasn't even a real princess in the true sense, merely the daughter of a mother who thought her nothing more than trash, annoyed even by a single glance her way. Why was she able to receive everyone's love and favor? She couldn't understand it. Even the Earl's own daughter had been willing to become her personal maid. Yet the maid told her she was, by right, the Empire's most exalted existence, and golden hair and blue eyes were the true mark of today's royal bloodline. Even the current emperor and consort remained excluded from the true seat of royal power. And besides, whoever met the little princess was bound to instantly adore her enough to cheer her up. Given her current age, now was exactly the right time to be spoiled with gifts. If she felt indebted, she could always give the Empress a small gift as thanks. If she could ever call her mother just once, the Empress would surely be overjoyed. However, the little princess assumed the maid was simply teasing her. The little princess then suggested she should give a gift to the crown prince too, since he'd been taking such good care of her. He really was a good person. The maid, however, thought this was the funniest thing she'd ever heard in her entire life. This was the first time ever she'd heard someone describe the utterly terrifying crown prince as a good person. And right now, the little princess was fretting over what gift would be appropriate to give. The maid suggested starting simple this time. Homemade cookies would be a good place to begin, just as the little princess wondered whether the crown prince might not even like cookies. The eager maid immediately set out, taking her to the kitchen to bake some. For this batch, they'd give the first ones to the Empress. Seeing the little bear plushie she always carried with her, the little princess remembered another person she needed to thank too. Since this was her very first time baking anything, the cookies weren't very impressive in shape. The frog was mistaken for a bear, but it actually showed how happy he was to receive the little princess's gift, and he said he would treasure it dearly. So he turned to the crown prince behind him to show off the gift he'd received. The maid was moved beyond words, while the crown prince behind them went wild. Complaining about the cookie's appearance, the little princess realized her handmade cookies hadn't won the prince's approval after all, and couldn't help feeling downcast. However, the maid behind them revealed a shocking secret. The cookies the crown prince used to make looked exactly like the little princess's. Both of them were stunned. The crown prince, now frozen in shock, under the maid's relentless pressing, had no choice but to admit the cookies actually showed real potential. The little princess said she would work even harder from now on, confident she could make them look better than her brothers. The crown prince was also moved, because this was the first time the girl had called him brother. The lowly count's daughter, driven purely by jealousy, deliberately knocked over the letter the little princess had personally prepared for the Empress. The girl thought the crown prince didn't want to be her brother and was too proud to apologize, so she could only look at him with a tearful, round little face. But the crown prince didn't blame her. Instead, he comforted her and acknowledged her as his little sister. The little princess stopped crying in his arms and slowly fell asleep. The crown prince carried her to her room, but the girl kept holding on to his hand, refusing to let go. Even half asleep, the little princess still worried that, as the consort's daughter, she might be cast aside by her brother. Not until the crown prince promised he would always stay by her side did the little princess finally fall asleep at ease. When she woke up, she was surprised to find the crown prince sleeping beside her, so she half opened her eyes to secretly look at his profile, marveling that their hair color was exactly the same. Little did she know, the man beside her was only pretending to sleep. It turned out the crown prince had already been woken up by the little princess's fidgeting hands and feet, so he teased her for having the habit of secretly watching people sleep, wondering exactly who she'd gotten that trait from. With the maid's hint, the crown prince suddenly realized how sensitive that remark was. Wouldn't it remind the girl of the terrible things her birth mother had done to her? Before he could get out any words of comfort, the little princess said she was just influenced by the crown prince's habit of pretending to sleep. The crown prince was won over by her curious logic, so he patted the girl's head and agreed, saying they really were exactly alike. The next moment, the man began urgently searching the room for something. The little princess looked at the crown prince in confusion, since her room had none of the crown prince's personal belongings. The maid told the little princess the crown prince was probably looking for the little cookies the princess had made by hand, but because he didn't like cookies, the little princess hadn't specially prepared any for him. So the crown prince stormed out angrily, but the little princess secretly resolved to practice hard, to make the little cookies look better, and give them to her brother next time. After the count repeatedly pleaded, the Empress also felt the punishment for the little girl had been too severe, so she lifted Lucia's punishment and let her come near the palace to mend their relationship. No matter what Lucia did, the Empress could always see the little princess's shadow in her. Lucia noticed the Empress's expression, but didn't know the reason behind it until the maid delivered the little cookies the princess had made herself. The Empress's face lit up with joy. Only then did the girl understand everything. She couldn't accept that the affection meant for her was being shared with someone else, so she deliberately knocked over the little princess's thank you gift prepared for the Empress. She was the Empire's rare golden-haired princess, born once in a century, yet in her mother's eyes she was forever trash who could never compare to her brother, all because of the Empire's rule that women couldn't take the throne. The current emperor became merely the Empress's consort, and the little princess, because of her golden hair and blue eyes, which so closely resembled the Empress, was hated by her own birth mother. Even the sickly daughter of Duke Huang looked down on her, until on the little princess's 18th birthday, she discovered the truth that her mother had murdered a maid. The consort originally wanted her to become the scapegoat for the maid's murder, but the little princess refused to cooperate and ultimately died tragically at her own mother's hands. However, all of this was just a nightmare the little princess had. Right now, she was still only an 8-year-old little girl. At first, the girl chalked up everything that would happen to a dream, but as time passed, many of the nightmares became reality, all because her twin brother secretly ate his own birthday cake and framed the little princess for it. The consort locked her in her room to reflect on it. For 3 days and 3 nights, without any food, but the little princess, who could see glimpses of the future, now had the ability to protect herself. Golden hair and blue eyes were the unique mark of the imperial heir. So right now, the Empress was her only hope of rescue, so she shouted for help in her room, hoping a passing maid might come to her aid. Surprisingly, the locked door turned out not to be locked at all. To avoid the possibility that this was just another way her mother was tormenting her, the little princess carefully avoided the passing maid and slipped out of the princess's residence, because she'd been confined to her quarters since childhood. The little princess had no idea where the Empress's chambers even were, so she took her first step relying purely on instinct. Walking through the unfamiliar garden, the extremely wary little princess noticed someone following her. It turned out to be her twin brother. But the very next moment, a stranger's hand covered the girl's mouth. The twins had been born on the very same day, yet their mother only loved the red-haired one. Under the mysterious stranger's cover, the little princess successfully hid her tracks. Without being spotted by the consort or her brother, her mother doted endlessly on her brother. While even a smile from her was too much to hope for, she had even gone so far as stabbing a knife into the little princess's chest. Thinking of this, tears rolled down the little princess's face like pearls, which startled the boy standing behind her. He quickly explained he hadn't meant to make the little girl cry, and bent down to slowly calm her emotions. Not until the boy met her eyes did the little princess recall she had once seen this boy's figure in her prophetic dream. Though she couldn't quite remember who he really was, she quickly retreated 800 meters away and asked the boy who he was. He had originally come following the Empress's order to attend the second prince's birthday party, but he really hated how arrogant and domineering the second prince was, so he had slipped out of the party. Seeing the girl hiding her identity under a cloak, he guessed she probably also didn't want to attend the prince's birthday party, so he suggested they keep each other's secret. Neither would tell anyone else. About the other slipping out, the boy then told the little princess that the Empress had originally arranged this grand banquet for the twin siblings to celebrate together, but the princess, who was also meant to be guest of honor, had never shown up, so he'd come to the back garden to try his luck, to see if he might get the chance to give the gift he'd prepared to the little princess. Only then did the girl realize today was also her birthday. Though they were twins, the spotlight belonged to her brother alone. Feeling so wronged, she blurted out without thinking that today was her birthday too. The girl feared this would give away her true identity. But the boy simply handed her the gift he was holding. The gift was a beautiful bracelet. The boy put the bracelet on the little princess's wrist and told her not to feel burdened. The princess would receive plenty more gifts at the banquet, and this one was simply a birthday gift from a friend. The little princess was deeply grateful for the boy's thoughtfulness, because this was the very first gift she had ever received in her life. As they parted, the boy still wished the little princess a happy birthday. The little princess smiled faintly, quietly memorizing the boy's face in her heart. If she managed to find the Empress, she would definitely tell the boy her name. After going through countless hardships, the little princess finally crawled out of the bushes, only to find the crown prince was the one who found her. The empire's frailest little princess had finally crossed mountains and made her way to another palace, just to see the Empress who could change her fate. Meanwhile, the crown prince had refused the request to attend the twins' birthday banquet, all because the scheming consort had not only stolen away his beloved father, but had also repeatedly harmed the people close to him. So anything connected to the consort filled the crown prince with intense disgust. He never believed the little princess could have golden hair and blue eyes just like his own, since he was born of the emperor and the vicious consort alone, and wasn't truly part of the imperial bloodline. So surely the rumor was wrong. The Empress had originally been the empire's last heir to the throne, but because of the rule barring women from ruling, she had chosen to marry the puppet emperor. and gave birth to the crown prince as the new emperor's chosen candidate. The crown prince, dissatisfied with this rule of the empire, declared that once he took the throne, his very first order would be to amend the constitution. Just then, a little fluffy figure crept out of the bushes. The guard who heard the noise readied himself to protect the crown prince at once, but the next second the man stopped him. Realizing it was only a small fluffy child, after staring at the girl for 3 minutes, the crown prince finally realized the rumor about the golden hair and blue eyes was actually true. Believing her to be the vicious consort's daughter, he asked the little princess what scheme she was up to. The little princess suddenly realized the cloak hiding her identity was already gone, so she gathered every ounce of courage and told her brother the crown prince her determination to see the Empress. If not for her distinctive golden hair and blue eyes, no one would ever believe the girl before them could be the Empire's one and only little princess. But the man refused. The little princess's request to see the Empress, sternly turning her down and sending someone to take her back to the consort. The next moment, having gone 3 days without a drop of water, the little princess collapsed unconscious. With her very last bit of strength, she still refused to return to her mother's palace. The crown prince was now at a loss. He had only meant to send her back where she belonged, never expecting the girl would faint. Only then did the man notice the girl's clothes were worse than even the lowest palace maid's, and her body was far frailer than children her age, so he immediately sent a guard to fetch a doctor to treat her. The Empire's most noble crown prince apparently had a 5-year-old daughter, and not only that, with the Empress's permission, had been secretly raising her in his own palace. This left everyone utterly shocked. The maid couldn't believe the little princess before her was actually the consort's daughter, since by looks she didn't resemble the consort's child at all. But the crown prince still wasn't at ease, keeping the vicious consort's daughter by his side. For now he only wanted to wait until the little princess recovered, then send her back to the vicious consort. But the doctor who arrived brought him a shocking piece of news. The little princess not only had severe external injuries, but also suffered from years of malnutrition, which was why she'd collapsed in the back garden. The doctor was curious whose child the girl was, but then happened to glance at the crown prince, who looked remarkably like the girl, and instantly understood. She quietly asked the crown prince whether the Empress knew about the girl's existence, ever since losing the daughter who died young. The Empress had fallen ill with grief, spending every day shut in her chambers reviewing memorials, trying to numb the pain. If the little princess were brought before her now, it might only remind her mother of that heartbreak. This was also why the crown prince had at first refused to let the princess meet her mother. Feigning concern, she asked about the girl's condition, whether it might affect the princess's healthy growth. The doctor had originally assumed the princess was just a 5-year-old little girl, and naturally wouldn't be at risk. But the knight then told her the little princess was actually 8 years old, which left the doctor utterly stunned. After all, the crown prince had only just recently held his coming-of-age ceremony, and now suddenly there was an 8-year-old daughter. She quickly stopped her own wild imagination. Realizing the little princess was the consort's daughter, the crown prince behind her looked at the doctor with a deeply serious face. It turned out someone had assumed he'd fathered a child out of wedlock. Just where had she gotten the nerve for that? But the man explained innocently. It was only because the crown prince happened to look so similar to the little princess. Who would have guessed the consort, who doted so much on her son, would not only arbitrarily cut the little princess's allowance, but redirect the funds to the prince instead. They'd always heard the consort favored her son over her daughter, but never imagined the bias would go this far. The head knight sarcastically asked the crown prince whether he intended to send the princess back to the consort. Now that he knew the little princess's true situation, naturally he couldn't send her back. But the responsibility of caring for the girl? Who would take that on? Because his personal attendants had all been harmed by the vicious consort before, they weren't the ideal candidates. However, he believed this wasn't the little princess's fault. So he took on the responsibility himself. When the little princess woke up again, she found herself lying on a soft, large bed, looking around at the splendid surroundings. She was so startled by a sudden shout that she nearly fell to the ground. Luckily, a pair of hands caught her just in time. No one expected that once recovered, the little princess would grab hold of the crown prince's sleeve, begging her brother to spare her life. The unloved little princess woke up to find herself in a magnificent golden palace, secretly relieved she hadn't been caught by her mother, recalling that before she fainted, she had seen the crown prince. To avoid further complications, the little princess had to leave as soon as possible and successfully find her way to the Empress, but the maid suddenly appeared behind her, startling the distracted little princess, who nearly fell. Luckily, a pair of large hands caught her just in time. The maid warmly introduced herself. She was actually the crown prince's personal attendant and would now be responsible for the little princess's daily care. The princess mistakenly thought she had just escaped her cruel mother's control, only to now be held captive by the crown prince. But her whispered complaint was overheard by the crown prince behind her. He sternly told her to speak properly. Realizing the crown prince was standing right behind her, the little princess collapsed to the ground in fright, clutching tightly onto his sleeve. Begging her brother to spare her life, the crown prince hadn't meant to frighten her. He bent down and apologized to his little sister. However, the princess never expected the crown prince would apologize to her, because the maids in the princess's quarters had always said the crown prince was a terrifying, wicked man who despised everything connected to the consort, including herself. Just as she thought this, her stomach suddenly growled loudly. The little princess blushed with embarrassment. But the next moment, the crown prince simply picked her up and carried her toward the dining hall, asking her what food she wanted most. Having lived in the cold palace before, no one had ever asked how she felt. She'd even had to eat cold leftovers, so she could only search her memory for the delicious food she'd once eaten in a dream, stammering out a single word. Fortunately, the crown prince quickly understood that what she wanted was dessert. This was the most delicious thing the little princess had eaten in her prophetic dream, though she couldn't remember who had given it to her. Only the terrifying memory her mother left her with remained. Because the little princess hadn't fully recovered yet, she could only drink soup today. The little princess knew very well she was living off someone else's kindness now. Being able to stay somewhere this nice and have food to eat was already more than enough. But when the little fluffy girl arrived at the dining hall, she looked like a tiny Thumbelina. Because she was so much smaller than children her age, so the crown prince personally held her while she ate, which left her flattered and overwhelmed. Seeing the girl's surprised expression, the crown prince assumed the food wasn't to her taste. To his surprise, plain vegetable soup could actually taste this good. She'd never eaten anything so delicious before, and asked the crown prince if she could have another bowl. The crown prince hadn't expected her to finish so quickly. But then the little princess realized she'd said something wrong, and quickly said, never mind if it wasn't convenient. After all, this was the first time she'd tasted anything so wonderful. The crown prince couldn't even imagine what kind of life the little princess had lived before. Being a princess herself, she had never even had vegetable soup, so he made the little princess a promise to bring her cocoa tomorrow to make up for missing dessert today. And this was the very first time the little princess had ever felt someone else's care for her, being fellow royal children. Yet the little princess had only ever lived in the cold palace. Thinking of this, the crown prince felt deep pain and immediately had a magnificent bedroom prepared for her, warning her never again to mention the wretched place she used to live. As long as she liked it, this room would be hers from now on. The little princess wasn't sure whether this happiness was something she truly deserved, but selfishly, she wanted to hold on to this bit of warmth. Though the little princess now lived a fairy tale-like life, she was still haunted by nightmares, because from the moment she was born, she had grown up amid her mother's beatings and scolding, never once enjoying the true rights that came with being a princess. Startled awake on the big bed, she found hot cocoa waiting for her. This was something the crown prince had ordered the maid to prepare in advance that very morning, just to keep his promise to his little sister. Though the hot cocoa was delicious, the little princess felt she didn't deserve it. Knowing full well how much her mother had wronged the crown prince, yet she was still greedily enjoying everything her brother gave her. If she would eventually have to leave, how could she ever repay the kindness she'd received in the crown prince's palace? Just then, the maid beside her interrupted her thoughts, loudly complaining about how dense the crown prince was. Just as the little princess was about to kindly warn her, the crown prince's questioning voice came from behind. Startled, the maid warned the prince not to suddenly appear from behind her like that. The night, arriving late, only added fuel to the fire. by agreeing wholeheartedly with the maid, though today was already the day after the little princess's birthday. He had still prepared a birthday gift for her, because this was only the second gift she'd ever received. While hugging her rabbit plushie, she accidentally revealed the bracelet the boy had given her before. The crown prince noticed the bracelet's fine craftsmanship and was certain it couldn't have come from the consort, so he quietly ordered an investigation into the bracelet's origin. Thinking about what her mother had done to her, compared with the brief happiness she now had, the contrast was stark, and she suddenly broke down crying, startling all three onlookers. Fortunately, the knight was skilled at soothing his little sister. He pulled out chocolate he'd prepared beforehand and successfully coaxed the little princess to sleep, but letting a small child eat chocolate to fall asleep was ultimately not a sustainable solution. Since none of them really knew how to care for a child, the maid suggested telling the Empress the truth, but both men strongly opposed the idea. They had originally assumed that being the vicious consort's daughter, she'd surely face insults and exclusion. But unexpectedly, the crown prince turned out to be a total sit-on, doting on her especially. Every year on the anniversary of the late princess's death, the Empress's emotions became very unstable, and during this time, she would even treat her relative's child, Lulu, as though she were her own daughter. If the Empress found out the little princess had endured years of abuse, it would surely devastate her. Not only that, if outsiders learned of the little princess's situation, and it spread throughout the empire, her reputation would quickly be exploited by the consort to escalate the abuse even further. So the crown prince decided to keep it secret for a while, until his mother's emotions had settled. Before telling her the truth about the princess, the little princess felt the vegetable soup wasn't quite as delicious as the first time. Ever since the knight had been caught secretly taking chocolate and had it confiscated by the maid, the little princess had no more chances to taste sweets and could only obediently drink soup in her room, though the kind maid reminded her she could ring the bell if she needed anything. The little princess who had once visited the dining hall had faced criticism. Once people learned she was the consort's daughter, their eyes were filled with contempt and displeasure. So she didn't dare ring the bell at all, and could only quietly wait in her room. But the next moment, the knight secretly came again to bring the little princess chocolate, only to be caught by the angry maid. Unexpectedly, the maid had prepared a lavish afternoon tea for the little princess, because with the doctor's permission, the little princess could now eat light meals. However, just as the little princess was enjoying her food, the crown prince suddenly appeared from behind her. Startled, the little princess choked. The maid shot the crown prince a resentful, accusing glare. The knight brought a little doll his sister had made for the princess. The little princess said she really liked it, but the crown prince teased her, saying she could be won over by a cheap little trinket. The little princess thought the crown prince's words were too much and instinctively talked back to him. Just as she was about to apologize, the crown prince said it was only his own joke gone too far. The little princess realized that although she was the consort's daughter, her brother the crown prince didn't hate her at all. But she still wanted to test her theory. One's own thoughts